And you should all see some lovely kittens. Is that correct? Somebody tell me if you can see kittens.
Yes, we can see kittens.
Cool. Right. In that case, without further ado, The Last Witch. The Case of Hellish Nell.
This is a Now It Can Be Told story. 4:25 in the Mediterranean on the afternoon of November the 25th, 1941. A salvo of torpedoes fired at close range struck HMS Barham. The stricken battleship heeled over to port. In 4 minutes of being hit, her after magazine blew up. She sank with a loss of 859 lives. The cause of the final explosion has never been ascertained. Probably it will never be known. Barham was the only British battleship sunk at sea by a German U-boat during this war. The only time a submarine beat the Royal Navy's destroyer screen. There have been no more poignant pictures than these.
It had been raining, but the early afternoon sunshine was beginning to break through the heavy grey clouds as the dirty and smoke-blackened train pulled out from Liverpool Lime Street Station to begin its steady, slow progress down to London. It was March 1944, and the news from the capital was bleak. The bomb shelters were once again full to capacity every night as people crowded together deep beneath the streets, seeking protection from the German V1 attacks and V2 attacks, which had once again commenced after almost a year of relative calm. Aboard the train was a young medical student by the name of Donald West. He glanced at the posters on the carriage walls, asking wartime travellers if their journeys were really necessary. Donald shrugged to himself. He had heard that there was going to be a witch trial, and he was determined to see it for himself. 19-year-old West had already been a member of the Society for Psychical Research for a number of years and had received an invitation from Molly Goldney, a leading light in the society, to join her for this remarkable event. Goldney herself was a notable investigator and a formidable opponent of fraudulent mediums, exposing many throughout her career. The following morning, Goldney made her way across London through the bomb-damaged streets toward the Old Bailey, London's central criminal court, and meeting with West en route. A queue of people was already gathering outside the courts, the line extending far down the street. Some of them were spiritualists. Several were holding banners and signs proclaiming the accused to be innocent. But most were ordinary citizens who, like so many generations before, had gathered to follow the proceedings with a mix of curiosity and intrigue. As the first rays of the morning sun struck the dome of St. Paul's Cathedral, the crowd shuffled and gossiped. The spiritualists waved their banners and sang their hymns, all of them waiting for the public gallery of the court to open its doors. Over on a nearby corner, opposite the growing crowd, Goldney and West met and they exchanged pleasantries. Goldney jostled her way toward the entrance, with West in her wake. Soon they were both inside court number 4. The bomb-damaged public gallery was already crowded and space was limited. On the front benches, which had all been reserved, sat the gentlemen of the press, eager to report for their newspapers on the proceedings of this most unusual prosecution. In the courtroom sat the representative of the Director of Public Prosecutions, next to him the clerk of the court, and the remainder of the seats were filled with the legal counsel, the barristers, and their respective clerks and assistants. The jury of 7 people sat quietly, waiting for the trial to begin. The dock was as yet empty. 3 sharp raps shattered the silence, and without a word being spoken, everyone stood. Ahead of them, a door opened, and the alderman and the sheriffs emerged, followed by the judge, Sir Gerald Dodson, the Recorder of London, wearing his scarlet judge's robes and his wig. As the court usher intoned an ancient proclamation, the judge bowed towards the assembled officials, and all were seated. This was 1944, but little had changed in over 200 years. It was only at the beginning of the war that pens had replaced quills, and the herbal bouquets that adorned the courtroom, mementos of jail fever, had been discontinued. No longer was the judicial dais scattered with protective rue and other magical plants and dried flowers. The clerk stood and ordered that the prisoner be put up. The sound of a laboured, heavy footsteps could be heard ascending the stairs from the cells. Goldney, West, and the rest of the curious throng in the crowded gallery got their first sight of Helen Duncan. Duncan at this time was in her 40s, obese, with a reddish complexion. Her eyes were as black as her hair, and was matched by the black fur of the coat that enshrouded her. Next to Duncan stood a small, nervous-looking man in horn-rimmed spectacles, wearing a rather worn and crumpled suit. 2 other women also shared the dock, one a rival for Helen in build and also wearing furs, the other smaller, almost bird-like in her stature. All 3 operated the séance rooms in which the alleged offences had occurred. A hush fell over the court as the clerk began to read out the 7 charges. Victoria Helen Duncan, Ernest Edward Hartfield Homer, Elizabeth Ann Jones, and Francis Brown, you 4 are jointly charged upon an indictment which contains 7 counts. In the first count, that between the 1st of December 1943 and the 19th of January 1944, you each conspired together and with person or persons unknown to pretend to exercise or use a kind of conjuration, to wit, that through the agency of the said Helen Duncan, spirits of the deceased should appear to be present. In fact, in such place as the said Helen Duncan was in, and furthermore, that the said spirits were communicating with living persons then and there present, contrary to Section 4 of the Witchcraft Act 1735. The clerk then continued to read out the remaining charges. Other charges followed actual pretense to use conjuration, monetary fraud, and effecting a public mischief. In turn, each of the accused pled not guilty. Prosecuting counsel, John Maud, QC, took to the floor. His opening speech to the court described the events leading up to the arrest of the 4 accused. At a place known as the Master Temple Psychic Centre, which was in reality a room above Ernest Homer's pharmacy shop in Portsmouth, Stanley Worth, a lieutenant in the Royal Navy, had already attended several séances, which he considered to be poor and feeble. Hearing of his displeasure, Elizabeth Jones approached Worth in December 1943 and promised him something special in the new year. Jones said that a Mrs. Duncan was coming, describing her as a wondrous medium, able to materialize spirits from ectoplasm. The price of admission would not be cheap, 12 shillings and sixpence, around £50 in today's equivalent. Moore joked that this might seem to be a reasonable amount if one was going to see the ghost of Napoleon or the Duke of Wellington, but not much value for a mere bogus conjuring trick. However, Lieutenant Worth was sufficiently intrigued and bought tickets for himself and a fellow naval officer. On the appointed night they arrived. The scene within the seance room was typical. Chairs were arranged facing the cabinet, which in reality was just a curtained-off corner of the room. In the cabinet sat Mrs. Duncan, clad in a black gown. Blackout material covered the windows, and the only illumination was provided by a weak red bulb partially covered with a handkerchief to dim the light further. As Helen Duncan sipped her water, the prosecutor continued. Elizabeth Jones, who had entertained the troops during the last war, led the circle first, in prayer, then in song, which spiritualists claim to have raised the vibrations. On this occasion, it was south of the border, a favourite of the medium. Duncan, her head tilted and apparently snoring softly, by some means began to generate the ectoplasm, which crept sinuously from beneath the cabinet and out into the room. Lieutenant Worth was then invited to summon a spirit. In reply, the slightly sceptical officer asked if his aunt was present, even though he knew his aunt was still alive and well, driving an ambulance in London. Yes, came the husky reply, and the spirit, speaking through Helen, proceeded to pass on her greetings from the other side, together with other vague and meaningless messages for Worth. By the time the séance ended several hours later, Worth was indignant. In fact, he was so outraged at the spectacle he had just witnessed, he went straight to the police the following morning. Detective Inspector Ford of the Hampshire Police asked Lieutenant Worth if he would be prepared to return and attend another séance as a stooge. He agreed, and so on the evening of January the 19th, 1944, Worth, together with Reserve Constable Rupert Close, went again to the room above 301 Copner Road to attend another of Duncan's performances. This time, as the séance progressed, a series of spirit forms were manifested. A parrot appeared. His name was Bronco. The bird apparently came fluttering down from somewhere whenever its name was called. Bronco was then followed by a rabbit. After the rabbit departed, the father of one of the sitters appeared. In life, he had been a policeman, and through Duncan gave the man vague messages from his deceased father. As the spectral policeman began to bid his farewell, a scene of absolute chaos erupted as Constable Cross lunged towards the spirit, grabbing the ectoplasm as Worth shone his torch upwards towards the cabinet. Cross then blew his whistle to summon other policemen who were waiting outside. Several members of the circle shouted in protest, and Duncan shrieked obscenities. Elizabeth Jones attempted to knock the torch out of Worth's hand, while someone gave the police constable a hearty shove, knocking him off balance. Amongst all of the madness, the ectoplasm slipped from Cross's grasp and vanished, leaving no trace, but Cross swore it felt just like butter muslin that he had been holding on to. Hearing the account of the chaotic scene, a murmur of amusement spread through the public gallery, but the spiritualists present were defiantly unmoved. When the murmur died down, Maud completed his opening statements and gave way to the defence counsel. Charles Lowsby was an ardent spiritualist who stated that he would defend Duncan by the simple strategy of proving her to be a genuine medium, thereby precluding the possibility of fraud. Lowsby claimed to have 300 witnesses waiting to testify, but elected instead to call upon only 45, some of whom had attended dozens of seances with Duncan. One by one, they took the oath and told extraordinary accounts of spirits clothed in ectoplasm, the departed souls of parents, siblings, aunts, uncles. They described spectral hands reaching out and of kisses being planted on tear-streaked cheeks. As the testimony continued hour after hour, day after day, the juries became bored rigid. The press began to crave novelty, and the judge became irritated. Goldney and West sustained their fascination, but they too were forced to suppress the occasional yawn. After several days of tedious testimonials, Lowsby suddenly caused a stir. Without warning, he announced an offer for Mrs. Duncan to hold a special séance for the judge and the jury to demonstrate conclusively that she was a genuine medium. Hearing this, an excited murmur spread through the gallery. Hearing Lowsby's offer, Duncan, who had been staring impassively ahead throughout the proceedings, visibly flushed. West noted that she passed her hand across her forehead as if she might faint. When the judge turned down Lowsby's offer, saying that he had no desire for his courtroom to be turned into a sideshow, the press was disappointed and murmured between themselves. Several of the spiritualists booed at the judge and shouted encouragement towards Duncan. But West noted that Helen Duncan looked to be suddenly very much better. On the final day of the trial, Judgment Day, demand for seating was greater than ever. The chamber was cramped, so much so that when one of Goldney's SPR colleagues offered her a seat, the police took exception to his generosity and promptly ejected the man. When the proceedings finally got underway, Helen Duncan's composure, which had so far been resolute as Lowsby racked up his witnesses, suddenly seemed to melt away. Earlier in the trial, she had come up from the cells cocksure, almost as if to a hero's reception. By now, this composure had drained away to nothing, replaced by just a thin smile. For the remainder of the final day, she sat with as much elegance as a woman of her size could muster, and she removed her fur wrap. As the judge began his lengthy summing up, Duncan's emotions weakened further. The occasional sob could now be heard coming from the dock. As the judge concluded, the jury were discharged from reaching a verdict on all counts, except those that pertained to the Witchcraft Act. They retired around 4 o'clock to consider the verdict. During the 23 minutes that they were gone, the court was buzzing with rumours and speculation, and the occasional distant shout from the crowds assembling outside that could be heard above the murmur. Eventually, the jury filed back in, and the jury foreman stood to announce the verdict, and the court fell silent. The shouts from outside also ceased. Everyone stared expectantly toward the jury box. The foreman cleared his throat and announced that each of the defendants in turn were guilty on all counts. The crowds in the gallery surged, and there were shouts of protest and outrage, cheers from some quarters. The newspaper reporters rushed towards the press room to file their stories. Mrs. Duncan sat for a short period, unmoving, almost entranced. Then suddenly, as if released from a spell, she yelled out, "I never did!" with a Scottish accent. As the clerk called for order to be restored, the judge called the chief constable for Portsmouth to provide some background about Duncan and her co-accused. The police chief informed the court that Duncan had previously been found guilty and fined for a similar offence in Edinburgh in 1933, and that Duncan had threatened and cursed the woman who had on that occasion exposed her. But the most intriguing comment by the police chief was a brief mention of Duncan being investigated in 1941 for a possible breach of security after apparently predicting the sinking of a warship whose loss had not at the time been publicly acknowledged. Behind the smoke and mirrors of the séance room, this brief mention of a lost warship was a hint at what this current trial might really have been about. He concluded by calling Duncan an unmitigated humbug and a pest, with no redeeming features that he could think of. At the request of the defence counsel, sentencing was adjourned until the following Monday, and Helen Duncan, together with her 3 companions, were led away to the cells. As Duncan descended the steps, she cried out something which Mrs. Goldney reported as, "I have never heard so many lies in my life. I dinna ken why they should get away with it." Don't think that was quite a good Scottish accent. Duncan's eldest daughter yelled towards the judge that prison would kill her mother, pushing away several police officers who tried to intervene and pacify her. The following Monday, Judge Dodson sentenced Helen Duncan to 9 months in prison. Upon hearing the sentence, Duncan swooned to the floor, knocking over her chair. Several wardens struggled to help her back and led her away. As she left the court, Duncan could be heard yelling and cursing for several minutes. Her fellow conspirators were each bound over to keep the peace for a period of 2 years. The trial had been a punishing ordeal, lasting 7 days. The prosecutor and the judge now faced the full wrath of the spiritualists. The guardians of British justice had denied what was demonstrably true about life after death and had pilloried an innocent woman into the bargain. Psychical researchers took a more clinical view. Mrs. Goldney wrote to her good friend Harry Price to reassure him that he had not missed very much. Donald West thought it was clear that whilst Duncan was a fraud, the Crown failed to properly prove its case and had instead resorted to using a statute which made the 4 accused guilty from the moment of their indictment. The reporters and their respective newspapers made great play of this last witch trial, and their headlines have determined forever how this trial will be remembered and will be referred to. Helen Duncan will always be Britain's last witch. But of course, Helen Duncan was not a witch, but neither was she the innocent victim that she was portrayed as by her supporters at the time, and increasingly continues to be portrayed by later generations. Victoria Helen McFarlane was born in the Scottish town of Callander on the 25th of November, 1897. While still at school, she sometimes alarmed her fellow pupils with dire prophecies and hysterical outbursts. Her fiery temper and frequent outbursts had already earned her the name of Hellish Nell amongst her peers. After leaving school, Duncan worked for a time at the Dundee Royal Infirmary, where in 1916 she met and married Henry Duncan, a wounded war veteran who was supportive of her supposed supernatural talents. Henry persuaded Helen her psychic talents could be put to good use and generate some much-needed money. By now, they had 6 children to support. By 1926, she had progressed from occasional clairvoyant episodes and foretelling of future events into a medium who offered seances to clients in which she claimed to summon the spirits of their recently departed kin by emitting ectoplasm from her mouth. Duncan's fame as a medium spread, and during 1928, the photographer Harvey Metcalfe attended a series of seances at Duncan's house, during which he captured images of Duncan's spirit guide and other spirits apparently materializing. After being closely scrutinized, the pictures revealed that the spirits were being fraudulently produced by using a papier-mâché mask draped in an old bedsheet. Metcalfe's claims were dismissed immediately by Duncan and her supporters as themselves fake, and accused Metcalfe of mischief-making. Despite this apparent exposure, Duncan continued to hold her regular seances at her home. They were highly popular, and word soon spread further afield regarding Duncan's supernatural abilities. More and more people wanted to attend one of her seances, and it wasn't long before Duncan began to be invited to conduct seances in other towns and cities throughout Scotland and, later, the rest of the United Kingdom. As her fame and her reputation increased, she was invited by the London Spiritualist Alliance to attend their headquarters at Queensberry Place, South Kensington, in order that they could investigate for themselves her abilities. The LSA had formed in 1884, and by 1925, under their president, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, had moved to their new headquarters, which Sir Arthur had purchased for their use. At various periods between October 1930 and June of 1931, Helen Duncan was invited to undertake a series of seances at the LSA. The initial reports from these seances were mostly favourable, but it became apparent that some within the LSA thought perhaps Duncan was using trickery rather than anything supernatural. During one of the seances, a sample of the ectoplasm that seemingly emanated from the medium's mouth was obtained to be examined. The examination revealed that the ectoplasm was in fact cheesecloth, mixed with paper shreds and egg white. Upon discovering this and believing that Duncan may have been regurgitating material she had previously swallowed, the LSA introduced a simple measure of control by getting the medium to swallow some methylene blue dye before each seance. Following the introduction of this simple measure, the medium ceased to produce any further ectoplasm during her seances. Later, in 1931, the investigator Harry Price persuaded Duncan, upon payment of a £50 fee, to attend his National Laboratory for Psychical Research, LPR, to undertake a series of test seances for Price. The results of the LSA were known by this time, and Price sought to obtain and test for himself samples of the ectoplasm Duncan claimed to be producing. Price also hoped to carry out an X-ray examination of the stomach of the medium, which at first the medium violently objected to. Price was eventually able to obtain a sample of the ectoplasm in a bottle of distilled water, which he had carefully analysed. The sample was shown to contain nothing but egg white mixed with chemicals that caused it to coagulate and congeal. Upon being confronted with the results of the analysis by Price, Helen Duncan flew into a violent rage, rushing from the laboratory and making a noisy scene in the street outside, where her husband was forced to restrain her. Price wrote in his report of the séance that, "At the conclusion of the fourth séance, we led the medium to a settee and called for the apparatus. At the sight of it, the lady promptly went into a trance. She recovered, but then refused to be x-rayed. Her husband went up to her and told her it was going to be painless." To quote Price, "She then jumped up and gave him a smashing blow on the face, which sent her husband reeling. She went for Dr. William Brown, who was present. He dodged the blow. Mrs. Duncan, without the slightest warning, then dashed out into the street, had an attack of hysteria, and began to tear her séance garment into pieces. She clutched at the railings and screamed and screamed. Her husband tried to pacify her. It was useless, and I will leave it to the reader to visualize the scene. A 17-stone woman, clad in black sateen tights, locked to the railings, screaming at the top of her voice. A crowd gathered. The police arrived. The medical men with us explained the position and prevented the police from fetching an ambulance. When we got her back into the laboratory, she at once demanded to be x-rayed. In reply, Dr. Brown turned to Mr. Duncan and asked him to turn out his pockets. He refused and would not allow us to search him. There is no question that his wife had passed him the cheesecloth in the street. However, they gave us another séance, and the control said that we could cut off a piece of teleplasm when it appeared. The sight of half a dozen men, each with a pair of scissors, waiting for the word, was amusing. It came, and we all jumped. One of the doctors got hold of the stuff and secured a piece. The medium screamed, and the rest of the teleplasm went down her throat. This time, it wasn't cheesecloth. It proved to be paper soaked in egg white and folded into a flattened tube. Could anything be more infantile than a group of grown-up men wasting time, money, and energy on the antics of a fat female crook? In his report, Price published photographs of Duncan in the laboratory that revealed the fake spirits were made from cheesecloth, rubber gloves, and cut-out papier-mâché masks. The psychologist William McDougall, who attended several of the seances, pronounced that her whole performance was fraudulent. Following the publication of Price's report, Duncan's former maid, Mary McGinley, confessed in detail to having aided Duncan in her mediumship tricks, and upon learning of this confession, Duncan's husband revealed to Price that the materialisms were the result of regurgitating previously swallowed items. He added that this was only undertaken out of desperation when the spirits had apparently deserted her, and Duncan was able to produce ectoplasm by supernatural means. In 1936, the SPR researcher Nandor Fodor approached Helen Duncan with an offer of payment if she would conduct a seance whilst being filmed by an infrared camera. Duncan quickly refused, even though the amount of money was substantial. But in 1941, it was that Duncan came to the attention of senior government officials. In November of that year, she was in Portsmouth holding one of her regular seances. She was now 44 years old. During the seance, she announced that the battleship HMS Barham had been sunk. The sitters seemed astounded by this news. After all, there had been no official reports of such a disaster, and certainly nothing had been in the paper about an attack on the vessel. Yet amazingly, the warship had in fact been destroyed just days earlier on November the 25th, whilst in the Mediterranean, following an encounter with German submarine, the U-331. Moments after being torpedoed, Barham's powder magazine exploded, sending the stricken ship to the bottom, along with more than 800 of her 1,100-man crew. The Royal Navy had kept this loss a closely guarded secret. They feared that the news would be damaging to civilian morale. Duncan told her spellbound guests that the news was revealed to her by the spirit of one of the sailors who had gone down with the doomed ship. This apparently psychic revelation caused consternation to the authorities. How was Duncan picking up on military secrets? Was she a spy? Was she in contact with the Germans? Or was she perhaps obtaining information that had somehow leaked from inside the Admiralty or the War Office? The truth, however, was much more mundane. Portsmouth was and remains a key naval base, and many of the families who lived there had family serving in the Royal Navy or working in the busy naval dockyards. Following an investigation, it quickly transpired that the sinking of HMS Barham was not quite as secret as it might have first appeared at first. It was indeed true that the government had imposed a nationwide blackout on the report of the sinking, but the Admiralty had already informed the next of kin of the sailors who died as a result of the sinking. It also transpired that several of the next of kin were members of the spiritualist group and had approached Duncan in the hope of some messages of comfort from their loved ones so recently killed in action. By the time of the seance, a few days after the sinking, there were literally hundreds of people throughout Portsmouth who were aware of the sinking and the great loss of life aboard the Barham, including Helen Duncan, following the visits to her by the next of kin. As the war continued and D-Day drew nearer, the authorities began to become nervous of any information about the planned invasions leaking to the enemy. Portsmouth was the major port of embarkation, and the town and the surrounding districts were filled with massing troops and equipment. Duncan, meanwhile, continued her seances, and from time to time she came to the attention of the authorities with her predictions and her messages from the spirits, some of which were militarily sensitive and could potentially give an attentive enemy agent helpful information. They needed to act to ensure that nothing about the D-Day planning leaked, and when a disgruntled Lieutenant Worth walked into the police station, that was the excuse they needed. It has been suggested, and is indeed quite likely, that Lieutenant Worth was in fact already working for the intelligence services, and that he had been sent along to the séance in order to either observe the proceedings or to seek some excuse to have them closed down, at least for the duration of the D-Day preparations. Whatever the truth may be, Duncan was charged using an obscure act from the 18th century, the Witchcraft and Vagrancy Act. But it is important to understand that Helen Duncan was not charged with any offences in the part of the act that pertained to witchcraft. Rather, Duncan and her associates were charged using a section of that act which covered fortune-telling and fraudulently obtaining money. In 1994, documents released under the 50-year secrecy rule revealed for the first time that Winston Churchill himself had questioned the need for Duncan to be tried, calling the whole affair costly and referring to the trial as an act of tomfoolery. Let me just make sure I'm still in sequence with the slides. I don't think we are, actually. There we go. Sorry, let me just catch up. I think the computer got a bit behind me there. A momentary pause while we look at vessels embarking at D-Day. There you go, there's Prime Minister. Helen Duncan was released in 1945 after serving her sentence and promised upon her release to conduct no further séances. This promise was not upheld, and she continued with her séances right up to her death in 1956 at her home in Edinburgh. Her séances were secretive affairs promoted by word of mouth. Shortly before her death, Duncan was arrested once more, following further allegations of fraud during a séance, but she died before any charges could be laid. The picture on the screen is one that is recently discovered, never been published image taken of a séance room at the Crewe Spiritualist Church in 1955, showing the setup ahead of one of Duncan's final séances in the year before she died. Contrary to what some spiritualists have claimed or suggested, there was nothing unusual about the manner of her death, and it was not caused by her trance being broken by the police. She died at her home after suffering from a heart attack. She had a long history of ill health and heart disease. Her doctor described her in 1945 as an obese woman who could move only slowly and who needed regular assistance, adding that she suffered from heart trouble. Following her death, Duncan is often cited as a classic example of a fraudulent medium, exposed by psychical research several times, but continually acknowledged by spiritualists at the time of being fraudulent. However, she still has many supporters within the spiritual community. Descendants and supporters of Duncan have campaigned on a number of occasions to have her posthumously pardoned for her witchcraft charges. Petitions for pardon have been rejected by the Scottish Parliament in 2001, 2008, and in 2012, her supporters continued their campaign and maintain a website and an online petition. Speaking to spiritualists today, there are many who still fervently believe that Helen Duncan was genuine. A few years ago, I was invited to present the John Finlay Memorial Lecture at the Kilmarnock Spiritualist Church. During the course of that visit, the conversation turned to Duncan, and I was shocked to be handed an envelope from the minister. Inside were several photographs and other items which he had held in his possession since the 1950s. At that time, he was a young man living in Crewe, Cheshire. The minister at that time was an elderly lady called Mrs. Hamilton, who told him about Helen Duncan's visit to the Crewe Spiritualist National Union Church in 1955, the year before she died. These images were previously unknown and I don't believe have ever been published. We've already seen earlier the picture of Peggy given to Mrs. Hamilton by Duncan, Peggy being Helen Duncan's spirit guide, and also the picture showing the room set up for Duncan, which includes 2 spirit trumpets in the foreground. But to conclude, let me just show you another of the items in that envelope. This decorative bookmark was given as a Christmas gift by Helen Duncan to her friends Ada and Fred, both members of the Crew Church. The bookmark is signed by Helen Duncan and was sent in December 1955, just a few short months before she died. Helen Duncan will always remain a controversial character. Many believe her to be a genuine example of a medium persecuted by the state. It is a fact that she was tried and found guilty of fraudulent practice several times, and that when she was tested by members of the Spiritualist Alliance, they too concluded that she was using trickery in order to manifest her ectoplasmic spirits. Whatever the truth, or whatever your belief, Helen Duncan will always forever be associated with the story, itself a fiction, that she was Britain's last witch. The end. I think it's time for questions, isn't it?
I've just realised I haven't unmuted myself. Right. Okay. Sorry about that. I do not know who is doing the questions, whether it's me or Christian or Christian. Are you doing them or am I?
I can do them. I'm here. Why not?
Okay. I'll hand over to you then.
Okay, let's scroll back up this. So let me go back to the top. So actually, I don't think in terms of questions, there's many questions. More, I think a lot of people were entranced by your great presentation this evening. I'm trying to...
And my attempts at the Scottish accent.
That was the big draw. So in terms of questions, the questions are very quiet tonight. There doesn't appear to be any. How crazy is that? So let me tell you something. So I think a lot of people still talk about...
Surprised, get mad. I suppose a lot of people had their say in the comments on the Facebook group earlier.
So I mean, a lot of people use her as a kind of martyr figure. I mean, even conversations and discussions that I've had with spiritualists over the years, they always hold Helen Duncan up as a kind of a pariah for the cause of mediumship, and they declare that she is the great. And obviously there is, satisfactory evidence that says that she was conducting fraudulent seances in this regard. Why do you think her kind of mystique continues?
I think it comes down to the headline, because in 1944, we were in the middle of a war. Well, we were drawing towards the end of a war. We didn't know it at the time. And then, as Donald West himself, this 19-year-old medical student had read that there was going to be a witch trial. And I think that's just got into the public psyche. And it's kind of stuck there. The books have used that same title of Britain's Last Witch. And I think it's just kind of got, it's become our Salem witches. It's just got into our psyche and into our culture.
So the one thing I noticed was the first comment actually I put was flower psychometry. I saw it on the little news blurb that you put up in one of your news clippings regarding her. I'd never heard of flower psychometry. Have you ever seen that before?
No.
But
I mean, well, there were mediums who who would apport flowers, but not psychometrize them. That was, there are many strange things. I've encountered ashtray divination a few years ago at a haunted location.
Yeah,
I was invited to go and take a look at ashtray divination, which turned out to be, one of those floor-standing ashtrays. I remember my grandfather had one. It stood alongside his chair, but they had one of those, and I expected, it was going to be like tea leaves. They were going to read the fag butts or patterns in the ashes, but no, they dutifully put their fingertips onto the top of this ashtray and proceeded to rock it back and forth.
Oh, it's tipsology style, eh?
Yeah, I'm disappointed, to be honest, but there we go.
So Aisling says the regurgitated cloth must have been sore on her stomach and her esophagus. I mean, does anyone today still use the cheesecloth?
I personally, I'm not aware of any. I mean, this question of irritating, I'm not so sure, speaking medically, that necessarily it would irritate, because perhaps the first few occasions it may, but then we have the ability to adapt and to get used to these unusual sensations, and it's not a substantial material. And in the case of Duncan, where it was mixed with egg whites or paper, I mean, lots of people, kids that chew bits of paper occasionally, the cats eat paper. This material, I think, with the addition of the egg whites, becomes just a slimy, gooey mess. I don't think it's necessarily too irritating.
Patricia says here, it's a complicated way to make money if that was her motivation. I mean, ultimately, people scoff at that, but that's actually quite true. In many ways, going to a medium actually was the equivalent of also going to the theatre, going to see a show. It was often for the same kind of value. It was for the sense of going to a public entertainment. You went along to a medium that particular week. That was a similar kind of price as well. That's why you always saw them on the piers and on the shop fronts, because of course that's where a lot of mediums worked at the harbours, because of course everyone came off the steamboats and then into the towns, and ultimately that's why they always had their kind of their fortune-telling booth along the seafront, as it were, a lot of the shows.
But I mean, we has anything really changed between 2024 and 1944? My local newspaper is this week carrying an advertisement for an international award-winning psychic medium who's going to be appearing in the village pub later in the week. But I mean, if we look at the prices, Duncan was charging 12 shillings and sixpence, which was a great deal of money for 1944. Way more than the current prices of £5 or £10. I was speaking to another local award-winning international celebrity psychic medium who was on the pub circuit, and she was saying to me that her psychic abilities aside, it bought her a new kitchen.
All right, so yeah, it works out to be around £67. So yeah, that is about right.
Yeah, I mean that's way more than a night at the theatre. Well, a night at the cinema. I think the theatre would be substantially more than that. But we have to try and view it in terms of the times. In 1944, and as I said in the talk, Barham and many other naval vessels, indeed the civilian population itself, had been bombed to smithereens, and people were desperate for some comfort to that their near ones, dear ones who had been buried under rubble or sank at sea were safe, that they survived. This is the same resurgence that we saw after World War One. This huge upsurge in spiritualism and spirit interest that followed World War One. Not to necessarily to the same extent in World War II, but it was still there. The same desire was still present.
So Julian Knight has put up a couple of questions that are wondering how people were led to believe that they saw their dead relatives in the ectoplasm. Is this down to darkened room pareidolia or the need for comfort? And are there any other major naval tragedies that she was aware of, such as when the HMS Hood sank in 1941?
I think, given that Hood was, Portsmouth, as I said, was a key naval town, it's likely that Duncan also, although there's no records of her doing so, gave mention of other accidents, sinkings at sea. Going back to the question that Julian raises, particularly the first one, wondering how people are led to believe that they saw the dead relatives in the ectoplasm, I think it's just a case there of the triumph of hope over the reality. They are in a darkened environment. They've gone along to the seance hoping for some crumb of comfort from the other side. And if they see a shape, a form, and they're then told that that is their deceased relative, then their mind will happily fill in any blanks and cancel out any doubts and reservations they may have. And I think we still see that today. I mean, if you go along to a spiritualist church, you see that same clamour for readings. When I sometimes visit the local spiritualist church or attend when we have psychics doing what they call gallery readings or platform readings here in the UK. And you see when they're casting about, I'm sensing a name. It's a J or a G, and they're showing me somebody who's. You can see waves of hands going up as people are trying to fit their desires into the narrative that the medium is providing them. And often, and quite strangely, you sometimes see. Not sometimes, commonly see, two people will be vying for the reading, trying, to make it fit their relative, their loved one, as opposed to the other person's loved one. It's really quite strange to see them scrapping over a psychic reading in that manner, but it does take place.
So in regards to, I can remember listening to this story perhaps 2007 or so. The hat is always seen as the kind of, it had the HMS Barnum insignia wrote on it. That's why they knew what ship it was. And I mean, are they relatively easy to reproduce? I mean, is it just embroidered letters is what they saw in regards to the figure that was allegedly presented to the people there?
Well, the LSA themselves said that, well, I'm Price also, that it was papier-mâché, it was rubber gloves, it was... Yeah. And these are tricks that mediums had been using. These were well-established tricks. I mean, if you look at the Florence Cook seances with Sir William Crookes, that's always two names that get me. You can still see that, you see these dolls' heads, these papier-mâché rubber contrivances that in the dark, they resemble a human face. And, of course, they are perceived as such, pareidolia. This innate, hardwired ability within the human brain, and it's something that we cover in Paravision, which is coming out later this year, that we just can't help ourselves. You might be, a hard-nosed skeptic, but your brain will still see, it's hardwired to see faces and recognize patterns and shapes. And there's nothing we can do about it.
Yeah, Jackie Tonks mentions here about Doris Stokes used letters written to her by people to predict who would attend her shows, not shoes, and she would present that as the correct people to the relative messages that were there. And of course, that's happened a number of times now, hasn't it? That essentially they're fishing for information, hot details from the letters.
There's a medium who did the circuit just pre-lockdown, and his claim to fame, or his USP, was that he could tell you the colour of your front door. Well, that's an extraordinary claim. Or on the face of it, it might seem like an extraordinary claim, except that you could only buy tickets by email.
So you pop up the old Google Maps. Yeah, of course. Very good, very good.
And actually, a number of the audience questioned him on that, which was interesting.
I fooled a cold reader once by wearing an old engagement ring. So is there actually is there a banter within, say, the skeptical community or those who are out just to kind of create a bit of mischief, going along to spiritualist shows just to put the medium off, just to see how much they can bother them?
I'm a ghost hunter. I don't really concern myself with mediums or testing mediums, and to be honest, I've got no desire to. Periodically, I do ask someone if they would be so kind as to give me their psychic impressions. And I think in some cases that is relevant. I don't think it's the role of I think it's the role of the parapsychologist to test these claims. I don't think it's the role of the ghost hunter or the average psychical researcher to challenge mediums. They are incredibly skilled at what they do. They are incredibly adept at what they do. And I have seen so many, I'm going to go in tonight and I'm going to sort this medium out, come crashing down in, a fireball when the medium has just run rings around them. Because these people have been, they are masters of their craft. They are, like a close-up mental conjurer. And to challenge them, to try and take one down by trying to trick them or mislead them, ultimately, in the vast majority of cases, just leaves the person who tried to bring the medium down looking foolish.
I suppose also you're in an environment where potentially there might be up to 30, 40 people who are also, heavy, ardent believers. So there is this, I'm on my own in this scenario. So yeah, I guess that can feel kind of pressuring, and you might feel the need to leave in those regards.
There's also quite strangely, because we are human and there are frailties within us all. I've sat in many of these performances, and I find myself periodically sort of getting carried along with it and finding that, oh, well, hang on a minute, my aunt died a couple of years ago, and she did have a blue car, and you have to sort of slap yourself around the face and go, well, stop it. There is this sort of, we like to fit patterns. It's what our brain is built to do.
So is there any more questions that anyone has that they'd like to put to Steve this evening? Or unless I'll hand it back over to CJ and to Claire.
So there's somebody else who's also had were you reading their comment before about fooling the reader by wearing an old engagement ring?
You had this one already. I had a free ticket, yes.
I did actually fool a medium once. It wasn't with an engagement ring. It was by means of, you can't probably see it, a very small crucifix around my neck. But I was having to be nice because it was a charity event held at the local Costa coffee store, and I just went along because it was a charity that I supported. We got coffee, we got cakes, and this was a medium I hadn't ever encountered before, and I was naturally curious. And they went around the room, and eventually it was my turn. And as he said to me, he pointed at me and he said, "I'm getting a mother figure." And I thought, so I started fidgeting with the cross quite openly outside of a t-shirt. And the medium then said, "Well, your mother wants you to know that she's glad that you were there when she passed." He said, "Do you understand?" I said, "Well, I understand what you're saying, yeah." And that she gave you something that you hold precious to you and you keep with you. And of course, I'm playing this bloody cross the whole time. And I said, "Well, can I just clarify, you are talking about my mother, my birth mother, because often, I'm aware that, you get mother-like figures, grandmother, the next door neighbor who was a stand-in mother when you were sent there for the afternoon." And he said, "No, this is your birth mother." And she repeats, she sends her love and is glad that, you were there when she passes, and she was happy to send you this message. Do you understand? And I couldn't help myself. It was a charity night. I shouldn't have, but I said, "Well, that's odd because she normally just phones."
Oh, nice. So there is a question from Patricia Donegan here, which says, "What do you think Helen Duncan's motivation was, in your opinion, Steve?"
Gosh, money. I mean, we saw that right at the start when her first husband, had said to her, look, love, we've got 6 kids. you've got this ability. She may actually have, she was at school at an early age. She did already have the reputation for foretelling the future. And it was, I think, his suggestion that we need some money. We can make money from this. And of course, the figures, the sums of money that were exchanged increased, and the fame, the ego increased as she started to tour around beyond, Scotland and then beyond. The amount of money that she was able to command increased, and it was a nice life, particularly in the growing up in austerity Scotland and then going through World War II. People wanted to know Helen Duncan. She was a celebrity. So
there's a message here from Julian Knight where it says, in Helen Duncan, the mystery show trial by Robert Hadley, it was a seance in May 1941 in Edinburgh, and there was a mention of the battleship sinking. This turned out to be HMS Hood, with 1,440 souls lost. Naval whispers in the Edinburgh naval community, or some other mode of communication, like Barnum Hood was a state secret. Is that just a conflated story that's been mixed together? Because that's what I'm getting from that.
There are so many stories. I based my entire talk on accounts that were, contemporary accounts at the time. And of course, you have the trial of Mrs. Duncan, which is literally a blow-by-blow. It's a transcript of the court proceedings. There is no mention of Hood or of any other battleship, but then they were only referring to the incident that took place in Portsmouth. They were unlikely to bring in any other trials. The earlier trial, which did take place, the regurgitation trial, that focused purely on, and I'm sure those with a legal mind will probably vouch for the fact that a trial is focused on the charge, and so it doesn't tend to. Duncan, she travelled the country. It's probably an inevitability that she knew of lots of sinkings, of lots of during World War II, the bombing of Coventry and Liverpool was suppressed to aid the national morale, but yet hundreds of thousands of people in Liverpool and Coventry knew that they had been bombed, and they could communicate outside of their town, city, to friends, relatives all around the country. It's very difficult to keep a secret.
Indeed. Claire, CJ, shall we round up this evening's talk?
They were asleep.
Could well be asleep. You got one of those voices.
Well, thanks.
Do you feel that old cases should be re-examined?
I'm sorry about that. I have to come over and move over the chair to get back to the microphone. Steve, is Claire still here? Do we know what's on next week?
Well, while Claire's waiting, for those, gives me an opportunity to promote an upcoming ASSAP training program, because we have face-to-face training, in-person training taking place late in April in Gloucester. And commencing next month in April, we will, I think it's a Sunday evenings, and I think it's going to be between 8 and 10 p.m., but we'll be having the first online training for the AAI module, and then later the ARI modules. And Norrie, the events officer, will be putting up the details hopefully very soon so that people can get themselves booked onto the online training, because the in-person training is full, at least for the AAI in April.
Right. Hi, CJ. Hello. We have William C. Graves, The Lady in the Bay Window. It's a story that's been it's got a lot of attention at the moment. Actually, I think he wrote it for charitable purposes, about a true haunting that happened in his home. So that's what we have next week.
Excellent. Looking forward to that. Thank you very much indeed to Steve for a superb presentation. Thank you to Claire for organising tonight, and thank you to Christian for doing the questions. Take care, everyone. God bless. See you all next week, yeah?
Good night.
Good night.